Previously on Faking Michael.
There was supposed to be a big meeting with all the engineers and the mixers about whether this is him or not.
I said, you have to come down. This is your opportunity to tell how you feel about these records.
At first, they were like, that's him, that's him.
On that one song that I was played, yes, I heard Michael.
And then upon, me saying, well, what is this? What is that? What is this? It just, certain people started raising questions.
He says, would Michael sing the words like Michael Jackson in a song? I go, I don't think so.
And then you go and get all the engineers that work for him, and they all said, we can't say it is.
There was never any conclusion drawn in that studio that day.
None of us ever said, this is definitely Michael.
But the general consensus was that, nah, this is not Michael.
At that point, Teddy flipped the script and was like, yep, that's him.
Who was trying to convince us that was Michael?
What John Branca should have said was, we don't want the songs at all. That's what he should have said.
And that's when they asked for more files from the Cassios and more proof and more this and more that. And another meeting would happen at the estate.
As we heard at the end of episode 4, following the conclusion of the listening session on the 17th of October 2010, attorney Howard Weitzman announced that Eddie Cascio and James Porte would be invited to a follow-up meeting at the LA office of estate co-executor John Branca to defend the authenticity of their songs. And so 2 days later, on the 19th of October 2010, Cascio and Porte flew from New Jersey to LA to attend that meeting. Accompanying Cascio and Porte at the meeting that day was studio engineer Stuart Brawley, who had worked on the songs in question as part of Cascio and Porte's production team before the files were sold to the estate. Also with them was their attorney, Donald Passman. Estate attorney Howard Weitzman was also at the meeting that day, along with co-executor John Branca, Michael's nephew, Tarrell Jackson, and the pop star's longtime recording engineer, Michael Prince. As we heard in the previous episode, Prince reached out to Eddie Cascio prior to the meeting, advising he and James Porte to bring all the evidence they had to answer all the red flags that had been raised regarding the tracks. But when Cascio and Porte showed up and were faced with those red flags, their response left those at the meeting with more questions than answers. Prince recalls.
When push came to shove and we had these meetings, and I asked him to bring the other hard drives, the backups, the other outtakes, the takes. He goes, oh no, this is the only hard drive that works. So I go, well, what do you mean that's the only hard drive that works? Well, once Michael had us make the comp, he asked us to destroy all the other vocal takes, so we did.
Jackson's nephew, Tarrell, recalls that Cascio and Porte claimed that the reason Jackson asked them to destroy all of the outtakes was because he was thrilled with his performance in the vocal composite they had created. But Prince, who recorded regularly with Jackson throughout the final decade of his life, insists that erasing Jackson's vocals is something that nobody would ever do.
Nobody would ever do that. Nobody would ever do that, It's Michael Jackson. He might change his mind. You don't ever erase anything, ever, And so the fact that they had one hard drive that had these songs on there and no other hard drive worked anymore, and they'd all been destroyed, and all the other takes had been erased, and even the computer they used at the time stopped working, so it was destroyed. They kept using the word destroyed. Mind you, they always had their lawyer sitting there with them.
Tarrell recalls the same thing.
They promised hard drives, but nothing showed up, and, they threw things away, and just a bunch of lies.
Cascio and Porte's claims that they had destroyed all the evidence of their supposedly extensive recording sessions with the King of Pop didn't make any sense. If the pair were amateurs, maybe, just maybe, this could pass as an innocent oversight on their behalf. A stupid mistake that was coming back to bite them. But they weren't amateurs at all. Porte in particular was a seasoned professional with a lot of experience. For years, Porte was the manager at the world-renowned Hit Factory recording studio, where he assisted Jackson's production team during the recording of his final studio album, Invincible, between 1999 and 2001. Prince recalls.
The other thing about, the audio dead ends, as far as this is the only working hard drive, these are the only vocal takes, they're all comped, you know what I mean, which is insane. James Porte was a second or third engineer at the Hit Factory when we were working on Invincible. He's not stupid, you know what I mean? He knows you make backups of your backups, and you never, ever erased anything, ever, So that whole thing just drove me nuts. That drove me nuts.
Prince recalls that during the meeting at the estate, someone asked engineer Stuart Brawley what role he played in the production of the tracks.
Somebody asked him, Stuart, what was your involvement in all this? He goes, well, they sent me the songs. My job was to make it sound like Michael. And he said that right in the meeting. And I'm going like, well, what does that mean?
Prince knew Brawley because Brawley had also worked on the Invincible album. Brawley had handled the mixing and digital editing for a number of tracks on the album, as well as recording Jackson's vocals.
It was amazing just to have him on the other side of the glass when we were recording his vocals. He was literally a one-man band when he sang. And Michael also liked to dance when he was singing and snap his fingers and stomp his feet. And literally, if you just soloed the microphone that he had recorded into, you didn't even need the music behind him. He was literally a one-man band, and there's nobody else like him.
And so when he began working on the Cascio tracks in early 2010, Brawley must have noticed that Jackson's trademark finger snaps and foot stomps were nowhere to be heard. Also missing were Jackson's trademark vocal inflections. The vocal inflections that were on the tracks had been sampled from previous Jackson songs. Because of his work with Jackson, Brawley had access to the singer's raw vocals from past projects. So when he said that his job was to make the Cascio tracks sound like Michael, was he referring to creating Frankenstein tracks? Tracks with samples of Jackson's real voice, stolen from past projects, and spliced into a fake lead vocal to trick people into believing that the entire thing was authentic? That's what the Jackson family had thought when they first heard them.
The version I heard had a lot of samples in it from other songs.
Sampled breaths after sampled breaths, mixed in with fake vocals to try to fool you.
You add an ad-lib here that is him, so now you're thinking the whole thing is him, but it's not.
And that's also what a number of the producers and engineers at the listening session 2 days prior had spoken about.
I went, wait a minute. I said, that's an ad-lib from Earth Song. I'm the one that busted him.
Engineer Michael Prince explains that when he learned of Brawley's involvement, he immediately connected the dots regarding how Cascio and Porte may have had access to all of the vocals that had been spliced into their tracks.
When I found out that, Eddie Cascio and James Porte hired Stuart to help them, quote unquote, finish those MJ songs, I started thinking about how we would have had access to a lot of MJ vocals and outtakes and ad-libs and stuff, and that bothered me quite a bit.
Prince recalls that no one in the meeting that day asked Brawley to present the material that Cascio and Porte had provided him to work with.
That was the one question I was mad at myself for really not asking, when we had that conference, because I talked more about where's the other hard drive, where's the computer, and all those things were quote unquote destroyed, not working, blah, blah, blah. And Stuart was sitting right across there with us, and I'd like to go back in time and go, so Stuart, can I hear the tracks before they were sent to you and then after you got done with them? Nobody ever did that. Nobody asked that question, you know? So that's still one of those mysteries. And Stuart has like disappeared, you know? I mean, I haven't heard his name, you know, since that meeting in 2000, God, what year was it, 2010?
In a desperate attempt to get some answers, Jackson's nephew, Terrell, pressed Cascio and Porte to explain the issues with the vocals. At first they said it was just a bad performance, which contradicted their earlier claims that Jackson was so happy with the vocal comp that he instructed them to delete all the outtakes. Cascio and Porte then claimed that these versions of the songs were just demos, and that they weren't intended to be Michael's final vocals. Because of this, they said, they had to use a voice editing software called Melodyne to fix all of the bad notes. This excuse would later be repeated by Teddy Riley when the producer was asked to explain the issues with the vocals.
When they first had it, they did the processing and they did melodyning because there were a lot of flat notes. Because Michael was going in to do the ideas, you know, he would never consider it being a final vocal, which is the reason why, you know, some of the vibrato sounds a little off or over-process. We truly apologize for that happening, but still in all, you're still getting the true Michael Jackson.
But Jackson's former producers and engineers, including Michael Prince, claimed that in their experience, Jackson had always sung with perfect pitch and had never needed the assistance of editing software. Prince recalls.
You never needed auto-tune with Michael or, you know, pitch correction or timing correction. I mean, it was just always perfect.
Prince also recalls that during the meeting, Cascio and Porte were asked whether they'd be willing to take a lie detector test.
Somebody said, will you be willing to take a lie detector test? And they go, no, you know? And, you know, of course, their lawyer, Don Passman, was sitting right next to them, you know, and he goes, no.
By this point, the meeting had become pointless. Cascio and Porte had flown all the way from New Jersey to LA to defend the authenticity of their songs, but they hadn't proven a thing. And so estate co-executor John Branca and attorney Howard Weitzman took each person at the meeting aside and asked them what they honestly thought about the tracks. Recording engineer Michael Prince, who had initially given Cascio and Porte the benefit of the doubt regarding the vocals, recalls what he told Branca and Weitzman when they asked him for his opinion.
In the middle of our meeting with Eddie Cascio and James Porte and their attorney, John Branca and Howard Weitzman took me back into a room and they said, well, what do you think? And I go, as an audio engineer, I said, there are too many audio dead ends for them to be telling the truth. You know, there are.
Jackson's nephew, Terrell, had heard enough. It was obvious to Terrell that the songs were fake, and it was obvious that Cascio and Porte were lying. Based on the evidence, it seemed as though Cascio and Porte had hired a sound-alike singer, who Terrell believed was Jason Malachi, to record the vocals, then hired Stuart Brawley to splice samples of Jackson's voice into the tracks to make them sound more authentic. And in their haste to find songs from Jackson's final years with fully completed vocals, Sony and the estate fell for it. Terrell had made his position clear, reiterating what he said in the listening session 2 days prior, that releasing the Cascio tracks would be defrauding the public. It was now up to Sony and the estate to do the right thing, to respect the Jackson family's wishes and to ditch the Cascio tracks. But Sony and the estate weren't giving up on the tracks that easily. Based on Terrell's belief that Jason Malachi, not his uncle Michael, was singing on the Cascio tracks, the powers that be at the Estate and Sony made several phone calls in an attempt to confirm that Jason wasn't involved.
Hello?
We know that these phone calls took place because several of those calls were intercepted by Jason's manager, Thaddeus Nowden. And each time he received a call, Thaddeus published a statement about it via his website. On the 18th of October 2010, Thaddeus announced that he had spoken to estate co-executor John Branca. The next day, on the 19th of October 2010, Thaddeus wrote that he'd received a second call, also from the estate. Then, on the 20th of October 2010, Thaddeus received a third phone call in 3 days, this time from Sony executive John Delp. And while the powers that be repeatedly reached out to Thaddeus regarding Jason's alleged involvement, the Jackson family continued to insist that the Cascio tracks were fake and should not be released.
It's not easy putting out this new Michael Jackson album. In fact, it's turned into a war among family and friends. The biggest issues have come because of what's known as the Cascio tracks. According to sources, co-executor John McClane has poisoned the water with Katherine Jackson regarding the Cascio family. On Monday, Miss Jackson apparently insisted that no tracks from the Cascio sessions be included.
What you just heard were the words of reporter Roger Friedman from an article he published on the 27th of October 2010, 8 days after the estate asked Eddie Cascio and James Porte to defend the authenticity of their songs. It's worth noting that by this point, Roger Friedman had been reporting on the Cascio tracks for almost 6 months. But curiously, despite the fact that he had the inside scoop about the tracks and had reported Eddie Caccio's involvement, Friedman had never mentioned James Porte by name in any of his articles to this point. It was almost as if Friedman was trying to keep Porte's name out of the story completely. But 3 people Friedman wasn't keeping out of the story were Michael Jackson's nephews, Terrell, TJ and Taj, who had continued protesting against the Cascio tracks behind the scenes. In his October 27 article, Friedman claimed that their opposition of the Cascio tracks was a simple matter of jealousy, claiming that Terrell, TJ and Taj had tried unsuccessfully to convince their uncle Michael to record their songs, and were now faced with the reality that he had chosen to record with Eddie Cascio instead of them. But Taj says that wasn't the case at all.
We were friends with the Cassios, and that was the hardest thing about it. Because it became us against them in a way, and it was pitted as that we were jealous of the Cassios and that we didn't have the musical talent to do what they did. And so that's why we're trying to tear them down, which is beyond the truth.
It should be noted at this point that Michael had indeed recorded with his nephews, who are successful musicians in their own right. Taj, TJ and Terrell have performed together since the 1990s as a group called 3T, and Michael's vocals feature on 2 of 3T's biggest hits, I Need You and Why.
But every time we spoke up, there was like a media machine that just destroyed us.
Despite the fact that the controversy was gaining more and more traction in the media, and that the behind-the-scenes battle regarding the Cascio tracks had not been resolved, Sony and the estate decided to move forward with the project, announcing that the album would be released by Sony's Epic Records on December 14, 2010. In a move that would serve as a worldwide litmus test to find out how Jackson's fans would react to the vocals, Sony and the estate also announced that the Cascio track, Breaking News, would be exclusively premiered on the 8th of November via michaeljackson.com.
The plot thickens to destroy Michael Jackson.
As the story unfolds,
if you thought there was
and when fans finally heard the track,
everybody wanting a piece of Michael Jackson.
That's not Michael. They can't bullshit me, man. That's not Michael's voice.
I don't think it's him. I really don't.
The results of that litmus test were overwhelmingly clear.
I'm on the official Sony website. It says breaking news by Michael Jackson. It's not possible. It's not possible.
The new Michael Jackson track called Breaking News, it's not Michael Jackson. It's this other singer, Jason Malachi.
Jason Malachi.
This is Jason Malachi.
This is Jason Malachi.
Everybody's saying that they don't believe it's Michael.
I mean, it's definitely not Michael Jackson, I guarantee you.
This song is fake.
Voice resembles Michael, but it's not him, man.
That ain't no Michael Jackson.
In response to the overwhelming outcry regarding breaking news, estate attorney Howard Weitzman published a statement detailing the investigation he had undertaken to verify the authenticity of the Cascio tracks. Upon its publication on November 11, 2010, Jackson's nephew, Terrell, and former Sony vice president, Corey Rooney, immediately called the statement into question, claiming via social media that there were a number of inaccuracies and omissions in the statement, and that things had not happened the way that Weitzman said they had. We discussed Weitzman's statement in episode 2, before we uncovered what really happened during the production of the album. This time, we'll go back through the statement with all of that new information in mind and identify the inaccuracies and omissions that Terrell and Rooney were referring to. The following are the words of Howard Weitzman from the statement, spoken by a voiceover artist.
There is nothing more important to the estate than Michael's music, his legacy, and his fans. As the Michael album was being put together, it was decided to bring Teddy Riley on board to work on several songs, including Breaking News, a song Michael recorded with Eddie Cascio and James Porte in late 2007 while living at the Cascio family home with his children. Riley produced and submitted Breaking News to Sony for inclusion on the album. At that time, no one ever mentioned that the vocals we heard on the Cascio songs, which were basically in demo format, might not be Michael.
Before we get into the bulk of Weitzman's statement, we need to address his claim that the Cascio tracks were, quote, basically in demo format. The 12 Cascio tracks were sold to the estate as fully completed songs, with fully completed lyrics and fully completed lead vocals, edited together from multiple vocal takes. The suggestion that they were demos simply isn't true. In fact, the suggestion that they were demos only came later, when questions regarding the authenticity of the vocals were raised. Now, back to the statement.
After the tracks were submitted to Sony, 3 of these Cascio songs were selected to be on the album, and Breaking News was one of the 3. The day after the submission and selection of the album tracks, for the very first time, the authenticity of Michael's vocals on the Cascio tracks was questioned.
The notion that the authenticity of the vocals wasn't questioned until after the selection of the album tracks isn't entirely accurate. As we heard in episode 3, Terrell, Teddy, and LaWanda had identified several red flags with the vocals on the Cascio tracks in early September 2010, more than a month before the submission and selection of the album tracks.
So when we played the records, we listened to them, and I remember me saying to Teddy, there's a problem. It didn't sound right. It just didn't sound like a Michael Jackson project. Like there were no outtakes. We just knew something was wrong, and Teddy knew.
These concerns prompted LaWanda, Teddy, and Terrell to invite members of the Jackson family to the studio to listen to the tracks.
I remember him calling me and saying, like whispering on the phone, say, "Have you heard these tracks? They're not even him."
With the Jackson family saying the tracks were fake, Teddy told LaWanda to inform the powers that be that he wasn't going to continue working on the project unless they could provide Michael's original vocals.
I said I have sent emails over to Sony begging for original vocals.
In one of her emails sent on September 19, 2010, LaWanda went as far as stating that on some of the songs, you can tell MJ is not singing. But despite ongoing concerns regarding the vocals, Teddy continued to work on the Cascio tracks. Then, on the 16th of October, the day after the album tracks were selected, the concerns regarding the Cascio tracks reached fever pitch. That's when Estate co-executor John McClane also started saying the tracks were fake.
John McClane was calling everybody like crazy, losing it.
And so at that point, LaWanda and Tarrell blew the whistle on the full extent of what had been going on behind the scenes for more than a month.
I spoke with several people at the state, and I basically shared information.
And I said, we have a big problem. And I explained everything that had been going on. And I said, everybody I brought in who had listened to these vocals said there were problems.
Back to Weitzman's statement.
Because of these questions, I was immediately asked by co-executors John Branca and John McClane to conduct an investigation regarding the authenticity of the lead vocals on the Cascio tracks.
Weitzman goes on to mention the October 17, 2010 listening session that we heard about in episode 4.
6 of Michael's former producers and engineers who had worked with Michael over the past 30 years, Bruce Swedien, Matt Forger, Stuart Brawley, Michael Prince, Dr. Freeze, and Teddy Riley, were all invited to a listening session to hear the raw a cappella vocals of the Cascio tracks. They all confirmed that the vocal was definitely Michael.
There's a lot to unpack in these 2 sentences alone. Firstly, the listening session referenced in Weitzman's statement was not attended by 6 people. It was attended by more than a dozen people, including Corey Rooney, Tarrell Jackson, and others who weren't even mentioned in the statement. But for now, let's focus on the 6 people Weitzman does mention.
Bruce Swedien, Matt Forger, Stuart Brawley, Michael Prince, Dr. Freeze, Teddy Riley.
It should be noted that while all 6 people had heard the Cascio tracks, 2 of those people did not attend the listening session. One of those people is Jackson's longtime recording and mixing engineer, Bruce Swedien. Swedien's work with Jackson spanned a total of 26 years, during which time he recorded vocals for all of Jackson's studio albums.
I've worked with Michael since 1977, done The Wiz, the movie with him, and Off the Wall, Thriller, Bad, Dangerous, Invincible, done all those albums.
When contacted as part of this investigation, this was Swedien's response regarding whether or not he believed Michael was singing on the Cascio tracks.
There's no guarantee, because there's a lot of Michael impersonators that sound like him, just as there were Elvis impersonators and so on and so on. I do recall, though, that it didn't really sound like Michael.
A far cry from Weitzman's claim that Swedien said it was definitely Michael. The other person mentioned in Weitzman's statement as having attended the listening session, who was in fact not there, is engineer Stuart Brawley. While Brawley didn't attend the listening session, he did attend a subsequent meeting with Eddie Cascio and James Porte at the estate's office, which we heard about earlier in this episode. During that meeting, Brawley, who worked as part of Cascio and Porte's production team, said that his role was to make the tracks sound like Michael.
Somebody asked him, Stuart, what was your involvement in all this? He goes, well, my job was to make it sound like Michael.
In an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, published on the 1st of December 2010, Brawley again reiterated that his job was to make Michael sound like Michael. I tried to reach Brawley on several occasions as part of my investigation, but he didn't return my emails, calls, or messages. Brawley did, however, speak with Jamin Bull, one of the co-researchers of this podcast. In a series of messages sent via Twitter, Brawley told Jamin that he trusted Eddie Cascio and James Porte, and that he believes that the vocals on all of their tracks are indeed sung by Michael. Now let's go through the 4 people from Weitzman's statement: Michael Prince, Teddy Riley, Matt Forger, and Dr. Freeze, who really did attend the listening session. We'll start with producer Dr. Freeze, who worked on several tracks with Jackson in the late 90s and early 2000s. According to those at the listening session, Freeze stated that he did not believe the vocals on the Cascio tracks were Michael's.
You had Freeze, who said, nah, I don't think it's him. Dr. Freeze said, I don't think it's him. He said, look, I recorded a bunch of records with him. Where is all of this? Where's all that? Plus, this vibrato and all this doesn't sound like him.
Former Sony Vice President Corey Rooney, who strongly voiced his opinion that the tracks were fake, recalls that Freeze made a point of commending him for standing up and speaking out.
He shook his head. He said, the music industry needs more people like you. He said, because there's too many people afraid to speak up and speak the truth.
Dr. Freeze did not respond to my attempts to contact him regarding the listening session or the Cascio tracks. Up next is engineer Matt Forger, whose work with Jackson spanned more than 15 years. I first met Forger during a research trip to LA in 2012, and we've been in contact for research purposes on numerous occasions since. In fact, Forger even wrote the foreword to a book I published about Michael's unreleased music, called Michael Jackson: Songs and Stories from the Vault. In our conversations and interviews over the years, Forger has always been candid with me regarding his recollection of the listening session referenced in Weitzman's statement.
I was asked by the estate if I could come to the studio and I could listen and I could offer an opinion. And I said, of course I would.
As we heard in episode 4, Forger confirmed to me that after listening to Breaking News, he did tell Weitzman that he thought the vocals belonged to Michael.
I listened to it, but I only listened to one track. I was only played one song. And on that one song that I was played, yes, I heard Michael.
But while Forger confirmed his opinion regarding Breaking News, he also said that contrary to Weitzman's statement, he didn't offer a guarantee because he hadn't been part of the recording process.
When I say something definitively, because I sat in the room and I did the work.
When I met with Forger in LA as part of my investigation, I asked if he would mind giving his opinion on a song that he may not have heard before. I didn't give Forger any information about the song. I just wanted his unbiased opinion. Graciously, Forger agreed, and so I went ahead and played it. As he listened, I asked Forger for his thoughts on the vocals, and he said that to him, it sounded like Michael Jackson. The only problem is that the song, called Don't Walk Away, is sung by Jason Malachi.
Hey, what's going on? This is Jason Malachi. Just to clear up all the doubt, this is my song, Don't Walk Away. I caught my baby telling her I'm on my way.
The reason I've included this anecdote is because it demonstrates that in some cases people, including people who worked with Michael for many years, are unable to tell his voice from someone who simply sounds like him. Regarding the Cascio track, Breaking News, these were Forger's final thoughts.
It's kind of like, I heard Michael's voice in there, and I know people can copy Michael very well, and I can't say that, it's impossible to fool people, and I think that's why it is unsettling. And, unfortunately, there's going to be this difference of opinion because that's all there is. Without Michael being here, it's someone's word against someone else's.
Let's now move on to recording engineer Michael Prince. When he first heard the Cascio tracks, Prince recalls that he gave Eddie Cascio the benefit of the doubt regarding the allegations of fake vocals.
Michael had a lot of respect for Eddie Cascio, and I couldn't believe Eddie would think about doing something like that.
Despite the fact that Jackson's trademark hand claps, finger snaps, foot stomps, and headphone bleed were missing from the lead vocal track, and that the vibrato didn't sound like Michael's vibrato, Prince initially chose to remain on the fence when Weitzman asked him for his opinion.
And that's what I told the estate. I go, it sounds like Michael. I said, I can't tell you 100% it is, and I can't tell you 100% that it isn't.
But when Cascio and Porte claimed that they'd erased all of Jackson's vocal outtakes and then destroyed their hard drives and computer, Prince was unable to accept their explanation as the truth.
As an audio engineer, I said there are too many audio dead ends for them to be telling the truth.
And regarding Weitzman's claim that Prince said it was definitely Michael?
None of us ever said, this is definitely Michael.
The fourth and final person listed in Weitzman's statement who actually did attend the October 17, 2010 listening session is producer Teddy Riley. As you heard throughout episodes 3 and 4, according to those who were in the studio with Teddy throughout the production of the Michael album, the producer had repeatedly expressed concerns regarding the authenticity of the vocals on the Cascio tracks.
He said it wasn't him. He knew, he told me it wasn't him. He said he knew that it wasn't him.
But on October 16, 2010, when meeting face-to-face with the estate's attorneys, including co-executor John Branca, Teddy said the exact opposite.
At that point, Teddy flipped the script and was like, yep, that's him, when he knew for a fact that there was wrong with those vocals.
Then, according to those who attended the October 17 listening session the very next day, in their presence, Teddy was again saying that he didn't think it was Michael.
Teddy, the entire time that we were in the room in front of him, was always alluding to the fact that it was not Michael. He kept alluding to the fact that this was not Michael Jackson.
But when Teddy spoke publicly for the first time on the eve of the November 8 premiere of Breaking News, his position had changed yet again.
These vocals are Michael Jackson.
When I reached out to Teddy to get his side of the story regarding the Michael album and the Cascio tracks, the producer sent me an alarming email, warning me that the people involved with the release of the project are very powerful, that I'm, quote, playing with fire by reporting this story, and that he doesn't wish to be involved because he has a family to protect. We'll come back to Teddy shortly, but for now, let's discuss those who also attended the listening session, but who attorney Howard Weitzman did not name in his statement. Mixing engineer Jean-Marie Horvat, who worked with Jackson during his life, was invited to mix the songs that Teddy had produced for the Michael album, including 2 Cascio tracks. Horvat recalls that when he heard the vocals on the tracks, he didn't think it sounded like Michael.
It just didn't, to me, it really didn't sound like Michael.
Despite starting the mixing process, Horvat recalls that he ultimately abandoned the project, leaving Teddy to finish the mixes on his own.
I just had to really recuse myself out of this whole thing. It didn't feel right to me.
As you heard in episode 4, Jackson's nephew, Terrell, was also at the listening session that day, and he was steadfast in his position that the tracks were fake.
We listened to the songs, and it was such an easy thing to prove that it's not him.
Terrell's manager, LaWanda, recalls that she too was skeptical about the authenticity of the vocals.
When you first heard the records, you knew there was a problem. It didn't take a rocket scientist to know, that doesn't sound right. It just didn't make sense.
LaWanda recalls that during the listening session, estate attorney Howard Weitzman asked her what she thought they should do regarding the Cascio tracks.
So me and Howard are sitting out, and he said, what would you have done? I said, I would scratch his records. I still don't understand why we can't scratch it.
According to LaWanda, Weitzman told her that scratching the Cascio tracks wasn't an option because the deal that estate co-executor John Branca had made with Eddie Cascio and James Porte guaranteed that their songs would be released.
He was like, I didn't want to do this deal. Branca did. He said, I wouldn't have done the deal. But unfortunately, these songs have to go on the album.
Former Sony Vice President Corey Rooney, who also attended the listening session, and who also felt that the Cascio tracks were fake, but whose opinion was also not cited in Weitzman's statement, said that the notion that everyone confirmed it was definitely Michael couldn't be further from the truth.
There was never any conclusion drawn in that studio that day, you know? But the general consensus was that, nah, this is not Michael.
Beyond the scope of the listening session, the estate continued to reach out to people who had worked with Jackson in the hopes that someone might definitively confirm that the vocals on the Cascio tracks were the real deal. One of those people was producer Quincy Jones, who worked on Jackson's Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad albums. When the estate played breaking news for Jones, the legendary producer refused to confirm it was Michael, saying that he couldn't tell one way or the other. Jackson's longtime composer and arranger, Brad Buxer, who worked closely with the King of Pop for 20 years, was also asked to listen to the tracks and to offer his opinion. Through his relationship with Jackson, Buxer had become familiar with the Cascio family and had even helped Eddie Cascio, Frank Cascio, and James Porte with their musical endeavours in the early 2000s. But when the estate played the isolated vocals for him,
faking, breaking the news.
Buxer immediately remarked that the vibrato of the singer did not belong to Michael. Engineer Michael Prince, who was with Buxer when the estate played it for him, recalls.
When Brad first heard it, he goes, because he knows Michael's voice so well, he goes, I can tell you 100% that's not Michael's vibrato. And I went like, wow.
The opinions of neither Brad Buxer nor Quincy Jones were mentioned in Howard Weitzman's statement. Weitzman did, however, name 2 additional Jackson collaborators, who he says told him the vocals on the Cascio tracks were indeed Michael's. One of those collaborators was Greg Fillinganes.
Michael's musical director and piano player, Greg Fillinganes, played on a Cascio track being produced for the album and said the voice was definitely Michael's.
Fillinganes did not respond to my emails seeking clarification, and when I called him to ask for his opinion about the Cascio tracks, he hung up on me. The other collaborator named in Weitzman's statement was Dorian Holley.
Dorian Holley, who was Michael's vocal director for his solo tours for 20 plus years, listened to the Cascio tracks and told me the lead vocal was Michael Jackson.
It should be noted that Dorian is married to criminal defense attorney Sean Holley, a partner at the law firm Kinsella, Isa, Weitzman, Kump, Holley, the same law firm at which Howard Weitzman was also a partner at the time. It should also be noted that while Dorian did perform live on stage with Michael on each of his solo tours, he was not Michael's vocal director for 20 plus years, as claimed by Howard Weitzman in his statement. As part of my investigation, I reached out to Dorian to ask him about Weitzman's other claim that Dorian believed the Cascio tracks were sung by Michael. Dorian and I exchanged several emails over the course of a week or so, and I sent him some of the Cascio tracks to listen to. When Dorian replied with his thoughts on the vocals, he said that based on his experience working with Michael, the Cascio vocalist sounded like someone impersonating him, and that he would bet good money that the singer was not Michael. In his statement, attorney Howard Weitzman goes on to claim that as part of their investigation, both Sony and the estate hired forensic audio experts to analyze the vocals.
The estate then retained one of the best-known forensic musicologists in the nation to listen to the vocals without any instrumental accompaniment and to compare them with a cappella vocals from previous Michael songs.
Why can't you be stalking me? That's the one I want.
This expert performed waveform analysis, an objective scientific test used to determine audio authenticity on the Cascio tracks, as well as previously released tracks with Michael's voice.
Michael Jackson, the host of them sucks, damn it.
And reported that all of the lead vocals analyzed were the voice of Michael Jackson.
Click here. Solution analysis suggests a high.
Sony Music conducted their own investigation by hiring yet a second well-respected forensic musicologist who also compared the a cappella lead vocals from the Cascio tracks against previously released vocals of Michael's, and found that it was Michael Jackson's voice on all sets of the raw vocals.
It should be noted that my research team and I reached out to Howard Weitzman on several occasions following the 2010 release of the Cascio tracks in an effort to get our hands on the forensic reports referenced in his statement, but that our calls and emails were not returned. It should also be noted that Weitzman died in April of 2021, and that to this day, the results of the forensic analyses Weitzman claims were conducted have never been published. And the experts who reportedly confirmed the vocals were Michael's have never been named. We'll return to the subject of forensics in a later episode, but for now, back to Weitzman's statement.
The Cascio tracks were also played for two very prominent persons in the music industry who played crucial roles in Michael's career. Both of these individuals believed that the lead vocals were Michael's.
It's unclear who the two prominent persons in the music industry who supposedly believed the vocals were Michael's actually were, because Weitzman didn't name either of them in his statement.
Just to be absolutely certain, I contacted Jason Malachi, a young singer who some persons had wrongfully alleged was a sound-alike singer that was hired to sing on the Cascio tracks.
Jason Malachi.
And I confirmed that he had no involvement with this project whatsoever.
I also reached out to Jason as part of my investigation, as did several other members of my research team. And in our conversations with him, Jason has never denied singing on the Cascio tracks. Jason has, however, repeatedly stated that the public has no idea what he's been through since the tracks were released, claiming that he and his family's lives have been threatened, and that his story will be told when the time is right. More on Jason and his alleged involvement with the Cascio tracks later, but now, back to Howard Weitzman's statement.
Sony decided that, given the overwhelming objective evidence resulting from the exhaustive investigations, they wanted to release a record that included 3 of the Cascio tracks, because they believed, without reservation, that the lead vocals on all of those tracks were sung by Michael Jackson.
This part of the statement is interesting. In it, Weitzman claims that the evidence outlined in his statement is what gave Sony the confidence to include the Cascio tracks on the album. Weitzman's use of the term "without reservation" is especially interesting. Without reservation means entirely, completely, 100%, Weitzman is saying that based on the evidence outlined in his statement, Sony had absolutely no doubt that the vocals were Michael's. But as we now know, Weitzman's statement was grossly inaccurate, and a lot of crucial evidence was omitted. So does this mean that Weitzman misled Sony by selectively presenting evidence shrouded in confirmation bias, while excluding the wealth of testimony from Jackson's family, friends, fans, and former collaborators who believed the tracks were fake, or at the very least, couldn't say for certain whether they were really Michael or not? We'll revisit that thought later, but for now, let's wrap up Weitzman's statement.
Ultimately, Michael's fans will be the judges of these songs, as they always are.
All the fans, everybody's saying that they don't believe it's Michael.
We take all fan comments very seriously.
That's not Michael.
It's not Michael Jackson.
It's not Michael.
This song is fake.
And as I'd stated above, there is nothing more important to the estate than Michael's music, his legacy, and his fans.
It's a slap in the face to the fans, and it's a slap in the face to Michael himself.
And this was fraud, and they didn't even care.
Michael's fans are extraordinary in their quest for accuracy and their passions to raise their voices in a search for truth.
I urge you guys out there to cancel all your pre-orders for the new album. Do not buy it whatsoever. It's a total sham.
It doesn't deserve to be released with Michael's name on it, so we've got to spread the word.
We join with them in our care and concern for Michael.
As we heard in episode 2, when Weitzman's statement was first published on the 11th of November 2010, it felt to me like a patronizing and disingenuous slap in the face. And that was before I'd done any research regarding the accuracy of the claims made in the statement. Today, after investigating this case for more than a decade, Weitzman's statement doesn't just feel like a slap in the face. Based on the evidence, we now know for sure that's exactly what it is. Michael's nephews, Taryll and Taj, recalled their reaction to learning that Sony and the estate were going ahead with the Cascio tracks, despite the objections of the Jackson family and Michael's fans around the world.
Like, I was confused and I was shocked. I was like, I can't believe they're going forward. Even with everybody saying no. And that to me is the upsetting part, because now you're confusing true fans that deserve to enjoy his music, but it's not him. So how do you do that? And how do you allow that?
And I just know that the songs and the album, there's a lot of money behind it. And so we've seen with anything that has MJ's name on it, that when there's a lot of money behind it, the truth really doesn't matter. It's the narrative and what they can spin that really matters. And so for us, we just were in the way from the narrative that they wanted to spin.
And at that point, you feel, where does this end? How does it stop? And that's the scary part of it, because if people can lie and get away with it, then what? And that's basically what happened, and it continues to happen.
Over the course of my investigation, I've given the estate's representatives several opportunities to speak with me, including attorney Howard Weitzman and co-executors John Branca and John McClain. For many years, my calls and emails went unanswered. But on the 14th of September 2018, after inviting them to interview with me for this podcast series, I finally got a response. A woman named Alicia, who worked for the estate's online team at the time, told me that the estate did not want to talk to me, and that they had asked her to tell me to stop contacting them.
I have been asked to inform you that none of the estate representatives wish to receive further communications from you, nor will they respond to any outreach from you. Please respect the wishes of the estate.
I also reached out to several people at Sony Music in the US as part of my investigation, including CEO Rob Stringer and executive John Delp. I emailed them, called them, and even went to the Sony Music headquarters in New York City during one of my research trips from Australia. But despite my best efforts, I wasn't able to speak with either of them. One person who was willing to speak with me was Amanda Ghost, the president of Sony's Epic Records at the time the Michael album was being produced. You heard from Ghost in episode 1, when she spoke in a radio interview about the care that would need to be taken with Jackson's unreleased music.
If we do release anything of unreleased material, it has to be fantastic and it can't damage in any way his legacy or his legend, and I won't let that happen at Epic. We've got to be respectful to the artist as well as the man.
Ghost made those statements on the 7th of July, 2009, less than 2 weeks after Jackson's sudden death, and long before Sony and the estate started working on the Michael album. And despite the fact that she was the president of Epic Records at the time, Ghost told me that her bosses at Sony weren't happy with what she had to say.
That statement I made, they weren't happy about that statement whatsoever. They didn't want me to say a damn thing about Michael Jackson. They didn't want me involved.
Just so that it's clear, Ghost is telling me that Sony wasn't happy that she had said it was important to respect Jackson's memory, that if new music was released, it had to be fantastic, and that she wouldn't allow it to damage Jackson's legacy.
They obviously didn't like what was in that statement.
Ghost told me that Sony executives Rob Stringer and John Delp were responsible for Sony's decisions regarding the Michael album, and that she wasn't allowed to hear the material or have any involvement in the production. She also told me that she was prevented from having any contact with John McClane, who was working on the album in his capacity as co-executor of the estate.
John McClane, when he found out that I was at Epic, tried to meet me. He asked Rob if he could deal with me directly, and Rob said absolutely not. John McClane and I never met, we never spoke, we were not allowed to communicate because Rob Stringer wanted to do it. And it wasn't because I didn't want to do it, I would have loved to have done it. I'm the biggest Michael Jackson fan ever, but Rob didn't want me to do it. When somebody like Michael Jackson dies, I think Sony they made a lot of money from the reissuing of records after his death. I don't know the exact amount, but they made a lot of money. That money, somebody wants to stand next to it and say, oh, I did it. And that was what Rob wanted to do. So it was a smash and grab. And I don't give a fuck if he is upset at me saying that, because it's fucking true. He ran the whole thing. So in terms of the Michael thing, all down to him. It's totally on him, all of it. He's the one who put John Delp in charge. I wasn't given any authority or any involvement in it whatsoever.
Given how excluded Ghost claims to have been from the entire project, I asked her whether she was even aware that questions had been raised regarding the authenticity of the vocals on some of the songs being considered for the album.
Oh yeah, I knew it was going on and I was told to butt out. I was told no, it doesn't concern me. Do you think I would have allowed music without him properly singing on? No, it's a travesty. But these fucking labels, man, they're just, they made a lot of money. But look, when you have those jobs, you don't care about music, you care about bottom line and making money. In terms of new music, it was taken away from me and run by Rob Stringer and John Delp. So.
Amanda Ghost isn't the only person I spoke to as part of my investigation who told me that Sony seemed to heavily prioritise commerce over art when it came to the production and release of the Michael album. As we heard in episode 3, producer Teddy Riley's manager at the time, LaWanda, recalled the day Rob Stringer and John Delp flew from New York to LA to visit Teddy in the studio so they could hear the material he'd been working on.
John Delp and Rob Stringer came. John Delp came in and he was like, oh, we're so excited, Teddy, blah, blah, blah. And he's saying, can you believe this? And I'm thinking he's going to say, we lost our biggest artist. Michael has done so much. We want to make this a great project.
But instead of discussing the music, LaWanda recalls that all they wanted to talk about was how much money they'd made by simply reissuing Jackson's old records.
John Delp was like, can you believe it? We made $20 million. That's his exact words. That's how excited he was. Me and Teddy were speechless. Speechless. Never once did anybody say, let's think about what Michael would have wanted in any of this. Nobody cared about Michael. Nobody cared about Michael's ideas. John Delp, Rob Stringer, they didn't give a shit. All it was about the money.
And despite the fact that Teddy's heart seemed to be in the right place at the beginning of the project, LaWanda recalls that even he became greedy as production progressed. As we heard in episode 4, Teddy shocked LaWanda when he pressured her to ask estate attorney Joel Katz for a stake in the publishing of Hollywood Tonight, the only track Teddy had been given to work on that he knew was really Michael.
We had Hollywood Tonight, which was 100% him, and then he began to get greedy, and that's when he made me get him that 10% of publishing on that. He demanded publishing off that song and was like, you go and ask.
The reason that LaWanda was so shocked at Teddy's demands for publishing was because Teddy had never worked on the track with Jackson during his life and played no part in writing the original version of it.
That was one of the things that made me look twice at Teddy like, really? You didn't write nothing on here.
But as we heard in episode 4, Teddy went on to write a spoken word section for the bridge of the track, which he asked Jackson's nephew, Terrell, to record.
She gave up her life to follow her dreams.
And once the bridge was recorded, using Teddy's lyrics, the producer suddenly had a much stronger argument for a stake in the song's publishing.
She wanted Hollywood. She wanted it bad.
After some initial resistance from the estate, Teddy not only managed to secure a percentage of the song's publishing, but also a songwriter's credit and a $75,000 production fee.
So they made up a whole new thing and gave him 10% of Hollywood Tonight, paid him $75,000 to mix it. It was just like a game or money play with them.
And as for Terrell, whose vocals Teddy used to bring Hollywood Tonight to completion,
they wouldn't give Terrell anything.
Despite his vocals being on the track, LaWanda recalls that the estate didn't want to pay Terrell a cent or give him credit as a featured vocalist.
They wouldn't pay Terrell anything. They didn't even want to give him credit, nothing.
Of the 10 tracks that comprise the Michael album, 4 of them include featured vocalists. There's Hold My Hand featuring R&B star Akon, Another Day featuring rock icon Lenny Kravitz, and the Cascio track Monster featuring a rap verse by 50 Cent. And all 3 of those features are clearly stated on the reverse side of the album cover. But despite LaWanda making it very clear that if they used the version of Hollywood Tonight with Terrell's voice, it absolutely had to say, featuring Terrell Jackson, the estate did the exact opposite, completely omitting his name from the track list.
So they didn't want to give him anything. They didn't want to give him 1 point, refused to give him credits, but you kept his vocals on the song. They didn't want to give Terrell nothing, and I fought for Terrell. I turned in his name. I have the original, I have the credits that got turned in. I have it all on my computer. They wouldn't give Terrell anything.
To add insult to injury, credit and payment for his contributions to Hollywood Tonight weren't the only things that Terrell missed out on at the time. As we discussed in episode 4, separately from the Michael album, Tarell had been working hard on his own music and was reluctant to speak out against the Cascio tracks, fearing that doing so might jeopardize his career.
I told him I don't want to get involved with it because I had the opportunity to get signed and pursue my music career. And I didn't want it to affect anything, and I was promised it wouldn't.
And so after being promised that it would not affect his career, Tarell raised his voice. And when he did, his fears became reality.
That was a situation where I lost an opportunity for a record contract because I spoke out against that album. I had several offers, but because I spoke out, they were all taken away from me.
And while everything that Tarell had worked hard for was taken away from him after he spoke out against the Cascio tracks, producer Teddy Riley was given everything he wanted. To go with the $75,000 and 10% publishing Teddy received for his work on Hollywood Tonight, the producer was also paid $50,000 per Cascio track for his remixes of Breaking News, Monster, and Burn Tonight, the latter of which wasn't even included on the album. Teddy also received $25,000 for the work he did on the Cascio track Keep Your Head Up, despite the fact that he abandoned production on it because of the vocals. In the end, Teddy alone was paid $250,000 for his work on the Michael album. And despite the fact that his manager, LaWanda, had negotiated his payment, she says that the way in which Teddy acted throughout the project ultimately drove her to resign from managing him before the album had even hit stores.
I was like, I can't do this. And I resigned, and everybody was in shock because I worked so hard and I didn't want to be a part of foolishness. He grabbed me by the arm and pushed me back.
He had betrayed me, my uncle, my family.
Teddy flipped the script and was like, yep, that's him.
And just went against everything that he said he stood for.
And Teddy lied. Teddy lied.
He just told me one thing and did another.
Now, I could have just stayed. I had integrity, and I said to myself, you either stand up for something or you fall for anything.
By the end of November 2010, the Cascio tracks had become a public relations nightmare. And so with the Michael album's December 14 release date fast approaching, Sony went into damage control, arranging for the Cascio family to do an exclusive interview with American talk show host Oprah Winfrey.
So also making news is the controversy surrounding the release of a new Michael Jackson album titled Michael, with 10 never-before-heard songs recorded before his death. Now, this is the Cascio family. They have been reluctant to come here today, afraid that they might be betraying a friendship that they've held so privately and dearly for over 25 years. That is how long they have had a secret relationship with the king of pop, Michael Jackson. He called them his second family, and they've written music together.
During the interview, Oprah gave Eddie Cascio an international platform to set the record straight regarding the authenticity of the vocals on his controversial tracks.
Michael and Eddie recorded 12 songs in the Cascio's basement. They are locked in a vault, and we're hearing 3 of them today. Eddie, there have been some questions, you know, about, first of all, that this is people saying that this isn't Michael's voice. Yes. You know that. What can you tell us about that?
I can tell you that it is Michael's voice. He recorded right there in my basement. It was a home studio, and you know, we worked. I was there pushing the buttons. He was right there directing, and that's Michael Jackson.
Joining Eddie to discuss the controversial tracks was producer Teddy Riley.
What do you say to the doubters?
I say to the doubters, this is Michael's voice.
Why do you say for sure it is him?
Because you can hear the authenticity in his voice, and you can hear like the natural part of him, and no one can really do a scream like that strong scream on the music that you hear, like Michael. I don't care if you get anyone, they will never be able to duplicate Michael's voice.
The fact that Teddy pointed to the screams when explaining why he was sure that the vocals were really Michael's is an interesting moment in his part of the interview.
No one can really do a scream like Michael.
As we've heard several times throughout this series, those involved in the production of the album, including Teddy, immediately identified that the screams on the Cascio tracks had been stolen from songs that Michael had released during his lifetime. And so while the screams were indeed Michael's voice, they certainly weren't recorded by Eddie in the Cascio family's basement. Another curious part of the interview is that neither Oprah nor Eddie made any mention of James Porte, despite the fact that he co-wrote, produced, copyrighted, and even sang background vocals on the tracks in question.
Eddie produced and wrote with Michael Jackson. Produced and written by Michael Jackson and Eddie Cascio. Michael and Eddie recorded 12 songs written and produced by Eddie Cascio and Michael Jackson.
As with Roger Friedman's articles leading up to the premiere of Breaking News, it again felt like there'd been a concerted effort to dissociate Porte from the Cascio tracks completely.
I think it's remarkable that this family has known Michael Jackson. This has been going on in your basement all of this time, and you all never told anybody. Thanks to the Cascio family. Thank you, Teddy Riley. Thank you, Eddie. Michael Jackson's new album, Michael, in stores December 14th, with all the exclusive tracks that we heard today.
Oprah concluded her segment about the Cascio tracks by reading the statement released by Sony's Epic Records, in which they assert their complete confidence in the authenticity of the vocals. And while the record company, Teddy Riley, and Eddie Cascio were given a platform to defend the tracks, no one from the Jackson family was given the opportunity to tell their side of the story. Michael's nephews, Taryll and Taj, recall how they felt seeing Teddy and the Cascio family on Oprah.
I was really upset and I was really shocked when I saw him on Oprah, because that was just betrayal to me. It was just betrayal. Because, like, you know this isn't true. You know this is a lie. Yet you're continuing, you're going along with it when you know it's wrong. And then on top of it, there's another layer of you knowing these people and them turning their back on him.
That did bother me. You know, here's these people that have fake songs on Michael Jackson and they're on Oprah. Their whole family's on Oprah. But I feel like people were put in positions where it was almost like you have to say this or you have to say that.
And when it comes down to it, it's always about money. And that's a hard thing to get away from, because there's always money involved in it. It's always about money.
In the next episode of Faking Michael, we'll learn more about the people behind the Cascio tracks.
Michael asked me if I was married, if I had any kids, and that one day he would love to meet them.
When Mr. Jackson first moved to Vegas, Angel Cascio came to visit within 2 days. So I knew that this was someone that was close to Mr. Jackson.
I can tell you, being his roommate, James was an MJ fanatic.
Michael didn't let many people into his world, and he let James in. He said, get with James and you guys start writing.
Michael never made an announcement when he was coming. He would just show up at the door.
He came ready to work, and that's what we did. We spent long hours working in the studio, recording.
I know that there was a studio in the house, so we knew they were working in the studio. Working on what? I couldn't tell you.
Faking Michael is a production of Oath Media, which is researched, written and narrated by me, Damian Shields. Original score, sound design and mixing by Dan Villalobos. Additional research by James Allais and Jamin Bull, and the teams at the MJ Cast and A Truth Untold. Artwork by Stephen Ward. If you enjoy the Faking Michael podcast, please consider rating, reviewing and sharing it. Faking Michael is an independent piece of investigative reporting. All source material is used in a limited and transformative way for the purposes of commentary, criticism, demonstration and education in accordance with fair use guidelines. Some of that material has been edited for clarity and time. If you'd like to contact the makers of this podcast, support our cause, or order a copy of the Faking Michael book, please visit our website at fakingmichael.com.